Hello and welcome to today's APBP webinar. I'm Madison Wallace, APBP's Program Manager, and we're thrilled that so many of you have joined us today. We'll begin the webinar in just a few minutes, and to help minimize distractions, please enter your questions for the presenters into the Q&A feature, and our moderator will get to those during the designated Q&A time at the end of the webinar. Also, we ask you to please continue to keep your microphones muted and cameras turned off. Before we get started, we'd like to share that registration for the 2024 APBP conference is open. This year's conference will be held August 12th through 14th in Detroit, Michigan. Join colleagues, friends, advocates, and experts for excellent training that will take your work and your career to the next level. APBP has submitted today's webinar for AICP credit, so be sure to take advantage of this opportunity if you need to log your credits with the American Planning Association. We hope you'll make plans to join us for the upcoming APBP webinars. APBP members can purchase a bundle package or individual webinars for a discounted rate. Visit apbp.org/webinars for more details. Thanks again for joining us for today's webinar, Updates to the New MUTCD, What You Need to Know, Part 2. If you missed Part 1, the recording can be accessed through the APBP Education Center. Our presenters today include Peter Kuntz. Peter is a technical expert and innovator working to match transportation policies with engineering practices, improving multimodal transportation safety and efficiency. He has over 25 years of experience and has worked in both the private and public sector, and as an adjunct professor at Portland State University teaching graduate level courses in transportation engineering. He has served on the boards of several university transportation centers and collaborates frequently with the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Clearinghouse at the University of North Carolina. He's a member of the Bicycle Technical Committee of the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices and is the past chair of the Transportation Research Board's Committee on Traffic Signal Systems. Additionally, we're joined by Katie Sawyer. Katie is a licensed civil engineer with a background in transportation engineering and program and project management. She specializes in the design and construction of active transportation and traffic safety improvement projects. As a former municipal engineer, Katie has insight into the planning, design, maintenance, and operations of city transportation systems. She's developed and implemented Vision Zero and traffic calming programs and has experience in community outreach and working with stakeholders, including elected officials. Katie is an associate member of the National Committee of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, where she helps to advance the adoption of complete street principles in the transportation profession. When she isn't improving the right-of-way, Katie may be found backpacking Appalachia with her family. Following Katie, we will hear from Jerry Shippa. Jerry is a traffic engineer with the City of Madison with 8 years experience working on traffic signal and street lighting systems, along with assisting in other various initiatives with the City of Madison and the surrounding area. Jerry has a degree in civil engineering from Michigan Technological University, where he focused his degree on transportation and is a licensed professional engineer in the state of Wisconsin. And lastly, but certainly not least, we will hear from Matt Johnson. Matt is a capital project manager and the bikeways coordinator for the Montgomery County Department of Transportation. He has 15 years of experience working in planning and project management in Montgomery County. He serves on the Bicycle Technical Committee of the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Public Policy from the Georgia Institute of Technology and a Master's of Community Planning from the University of Maryland College Park. I'll turn it over to Peter to get us started.
Sorry, a little trouble sharing the screen. I didn't have my slideshow up and running, so here we are. Sorry for the short delay. Welcome everybody into the APBP session on the future of the MUTCD. We had a great session one. Really want to give a shout out to Tom Bertulis, Paige Anderson, Jeremy Charzan, and Kevin Haas that did a great job to kind of lay the groundwork for this and start us on this path of, okay, now that we have a new edition, what's next? What can we expect? What should you be doing as an APB member in your community? And maybe how you get a little bit more involved as we think about the nature of how important this document is for moving forward really sensible and multimodal solutions for our community. I'm kind of serving as the moderator here, trying to set the stage. We have a great lineup for you as Madison just went through. So here we go. A little bit of background again. I think, one of the recognition I think the APBP has very strongly said is that, look, our streets and highways are not uniform. So trying to apply a uniform guidance on traffic control devices when we're contemplating the context of what transportation facilities are doing is really, I think, one of the key challenges as a transportation engineer. It's not just looking and stamping plans day after day that are the same thing. We have to think about the community and how what we do on the streets really does change and can influence the users that are out there. The users aren't uniform either. So that's another key aspect of this that, you have to think about who are we designing for? And so think about this, on the right side, that's me. I can bike anywhere. I'm happy to take a little more risks than the kid on the left that happens to be one of mine. So you think about this nature of where are we designing for, and the uniformity of users, it just breaks down. And so I think, that's where, as you think about applying the manual, I'll just say that APBP has been very clear in terms of who we're designing for, and that's certainly not the fearless cyclist that's out there on the day-to-day basis. We are thinking about the safety of all users and pedestrians at the forefront before we contemplate the notion of, gosh, we just need to move cars as fast as possible. And so I think a lot of communities would say they're in line with that. Certainly the USDOT has been strong in their messaging, which is really important in the face of our pedestrian safety epidemic that we have today. So if you think about where we were a few years ago before the MUTCD came out, one of the things that cities called for was a reframing and rewriting the MUTCD. And that's not to say that the MUTCD is all bad. There are some really great things in it. But if we're really aiming for Vision Zero, maybe the MUTCD did need a relook. So that was, I think, part of the conversation. Certainly supportive of updates. There's a lot of great work that happened since the previous manual. So we wanted a new manual, but certainly, it does take a reframing the problem. What is it that we're trying to solve, and how best do we do that? Our industry needs change to make sure we're up for the challenge of addressing getting to zero. So NACTO guidance was something that Secretary Fox, Secretary Ray LaHood before that had endorsed, and recognizing that there is some bias in the MUTCD towards cars. I think that's not a secret. The NACTO work and APBP has really advocated for positive changes and really thinking about how the MUTCD would take a safe systems approach. If you think about the nature of the MUTCD, the notion of bike boxes in the old edition were a little bit novel. I heard that term several times in the National Committee meetings. And that's something that, again, we want these to be easier to apply. We know there are proven safety benefits associated with these sorts of treatments. And if we want to design for the myriad of users that are coming our way, we should be thinking about this as a matter of a standard as opposed to something that's a one-off or a experiment. So we have a MUTCD now that what was in the NPA has come out into the edition, the 11th edition. And what's happening next, what you heard from Kevin from Oregon Department of Transportation, which I'm in the midst of, is we're working on then adopting that. So we have 2 years to adopt that document. Oregon writes its own supplement. So if you're working within a state, you might find out if that's an active ongoing effort. And one of the things that we've been tracking as a part of our work in Oregon is this notion of what are those issues? Autonomous vehicles, that's a new chapter. We got to go through that. We got to think about how that influenced all the other chapters. The real positive change of this edition is the speed limits are updated. So there's a lot more flexibility. We're not just using the 85th percentile anymore. So context can be incorporated into that. And I'll give you a little bit of background on that. Clearly, bus facilities is an area where we could use some additional support and more experience in terms of how that gets into the manual. And then, of course, as Jeremy mentioned in the previous session, the notion of PROAG is not incorporated in this edition of the MUTCD, and that will be coming out in a subsequent revision or a new edition. So inside the car, gosh, if you think about the notion of autonomous vehicles, it gets me a little bit on edge to think about what the robots are going to be doing, but I also think about the promise of a driving vehicle that perhaps does follow the speed limit and has good behavior. So I think when we can trust the robots is a big question for me. The other interesting part about that is the data that comes out of autonomous and connected vehicles. So we're pretty excited about watching this and seeing how we might use that to benefit our intersection treatments in the future. The notion of where speeds are too high and how we might address that with changes to the roadway is just another one of those gee whiz moments where I think there's some fantastic opportunities to advance pedestrian safety if we have better data about what the conditions are and where risks are highest. The NTSB report talked about that. And so this is something that pretty excited about the work that the National Committee did to look at this document, set up a task force, and then rewrite the language in the speed limits chapter. So section 2B, if you haven't looked at that yet, actually, I think NACTO has a webinar on this that's going on right now. So this notion of if you are thinking about working with your engineering community or actively working with them, ask them to take a look at the speed limits and think about updating some of that information on the streets and as you go about your daily work. Because that can be huge in terms of improving pedestrian bike safety. Thinking about how, again, we use the language there that provides more flexibility, increases consideration for pedestrian and bike travel. This notion of how we go in the future to address issues, this notion of bike lanes shall not be to the right of a right turn only lane, that's an issue that's still being resolved. If you think about the nature of this sort of a treatment, in this example from Portland, where we said, oh, wait a minute, this striping, it's a mistake that runs in violation to the MUTCD. But what we found when we did more investigation is that we didn't really have a strong basis for why this is the case and why a bike lane to the right of a right turn lane would be banned in all cases. If that's a low volume movement, maybe that's an okay treatment. So thinking about challenging kind of the status quo, at least thinking about, can we do an experiment to address whether this bike lane treatment that's a pocket right turn lane, is that truly the safest application that we can think of, or does that then impact the comfort of our users? Here's a compliant example where we're, again, the bike lane is adjacent to the vehicle traffic, sandwiched between the bus and the vehicles. Is that the right design that's going to get us to our multimodal goals and improve safety for all? I think it's still a question that's worth further exploration. So again, just to set the stage for a series of great presentations, that want to just reflect that if you think about Portland and our climate action plan, I like to say that the MUTCD may not reflect local policy. It doesn't get us to where we're going. PROAG, huge issue for us. We're going to watch that very closely, and there'll be more on that in the coming months and years. And then again, this notion of there's some bias. I like to say cities aren't always involved in the research, so we have to work with our partners. And we've been very active with Oregon Department of Transportation, and they've been very supportive to moving a multimodal safety effort forward. That's the end of my presentation. I'm excited to see Katie on screen here. She's going to take us to the next part of this webinar and really capture some of her activity at the National Committee. Katie?
Thanks, Peter. So today I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about some of the updates to Part 9, the bike chapter of the 11th edition, things that practitioners really need to be aware of as they start to utilize the 11th edition. And I will talk a little bit about how they relate to other parts in the manual that maybe you aren't looking for if you're specifically designing bike facilities, as well as how some of these things may have changed from the interim approvals issued by FHWA since the last manual was published. Let's see here. There we go. So one of the first things you'll see when you look at Part 9 is that the yield markings and sign requirements on bikeways has changed. I know that practitioners in the past putting a uncontrolled pedestrian crosswalk across a bikeway, if you wanted to use yield markings to really emphasize to bicyclists that they are required by law to yield to pedestrians in the crosswalk, you were forced to use a very motorist-centric yield sign or yield here to pedestrians. Those are large roadway signs that can really contribute to clutter. So Part 9 now allows practitioners to use a smaller yield to ped sign on those bikeways. And you'll find that both in Part 9 for stop and yield line markings, and then it's also included in Part 9 as well in the bike section. And the draft edition actually included, the draft 11th edition included how that may be used. So a transit island is a great example where you would be expecting a lot of pedestrians to be crossing the bikeway, and you really just want to let bicyclists know that they should be yielding. So now you can use this optional yield to ped sign. That will also impact the design of protected intersections as well. A protected intersection is shown in the 11th edition. However, it's largely silent on how you may treat things like the assignment of right-of-way and traffic control as well. But if you live in a state that is allows that yield condition at crosswalks and not stop, you could also use this yield to ped signs at those protected intersections. Another change, one of the good things is Part 2 does add bike symbols to the yield or stop here to pedestrian sign. So practitioners can use a single sign to alert motorists to yield to both bikes and peds when you have that bike facility present. The bad news is that Part 9 does not incorporate that bike signal into the turning vehicles yield or stop for pedestrian signs. A lot of agencies across the country have been wanting to combine the bike and ped symbols on that sign. Many are, whether through the request to experiment process through FHWA or just doing that on their own. Obviously, these typically get mounted at an intersection that has a lot of sign clutter going on already, and so you want to try to consolidate those signs to the greatest degree possible. Part 9 allows for the use of this new sign, the left turn yield to bikes, down at the bottom of the screen. So you do have the option of adding an additional sign, but unfortunately combining those symbols at this point is you'd still have to go through that request to experiment process. As Peter mentioned, the right turn lanes to the right of bike lanes, the 11th edition does require you to phase separate any bikeway that is to the right of a right turn lane. The draft edition actually made it so that for a separated bike lane, it advised against it, but it didn't necessarily preclude it. The 11th edition has revised that draft language in such a way that it's slightly ambiguous, And the problem lies in the definition section of the MUTCD, where a separated bicycle lane is considered a subset of a bicycle lane. So when you look at the language in Chapter 9, it really says that for a separated bike lane, you can't have that you can't have a right-only lane without phase separation. So something for practitioners to be aware of. I know at the National Committee, as well as other sponsoring organizations, very well aware of this, and I do think FHWA will be issuing some sort of interpretation of this language, or maybe even a revision to it at some point in the future. I can't guarantee when that will be, but it's certainly on everyone's radar that this was a change from the draft edition, and trying to clarify whether that was intentional. Good news is that when you do provide a right turn lane, when you have that space to provide the right turn lane to the right of a bike lane, these scenarios are now in the MUTCD. So you have those standardized pavement markings and signage and guidance about what sort of traffic control to use in those situations. Buffered and separated bike lanes. Separated bike lanes has been added to Part 9. It's a kind of minimal section, I think, but also the MUTCD is not a design manual, so sometimes less is good to allow designers the flexibility to design bike facilities that they feel are safe and serving all modes. One thing I will point out in the separated bike lane section is that there is a standard statement that requires that along a separated bike lane, you do restrict all right turns on red. So that's something that's important for practitioners to remember. And one thing that I thought was a little interesting, there's a section for bike lanes at intersection approaches, and it says that you can bend a bike lane in or out, meaning you can bend it in towards the travel lane or out towards the edge of roadway. And we know that those aren't necessarily they're not the same type of treatment. It's not a design manual, so there's no information on this, but as practitioners, we do know that there is a huge benefit to bending bike lanes out. An offset of 6 to 16.5 feet has been shown through research to really improve the safety for bicyclists. It reduces those crashes. And so I think it's important to note that while they're kind of presented as you can do either or, practitioners really need to remember that it's important to maintain and maximize that buffer space between vehicles and motorists to allow motorists more room to yield. And I think an important thing too to note is that you should be looking to the latest design guidance and not necessarily just the MUTCD on its own when you're trying to design these sorts of facilities. Green colored pavement markings are no longer an interim approval. They've been incorporated into the 11th edition. I know a lot of people were waiting for bated breath with shared lane markings and how they could be enhanced. The state of California in particular has a long history of requests to experiment regarding the greenback sharrows. Shared lane markings or super sharrows. And so a lot of people were waiting to see how FHWA would incorporate those. And this one, I have to admit, came out of left field a little bit. You can now use black pavement markings underneath your shared lane markings. This example from here in Pittsburgh, I think you can see when you have an asphalt street, if you were to provide black pavement markings under a shared lane marking, motorists probably aren't going to really pick that out compared to just the white pavement markings. You may get some, from a maintenance perspective, it may last longer, so that's good. But I will say this was kind of a surprise. I'm not aware of black back shared lane markings anywhere in the country. I'm not familiar with any research around this practice as well. And I suppose if you really wanted to, you could request to experiment with the greenback sharrows still. But I think FHWA has likely made their opinion pretty clear here that they are not in favor of the greenbacked shared lane markings. Bike boxes have made the jump from interim approval 18 into the 11th edition. One thing from that interim approval that made its way over is that when you use that bike box across multi-lane approaches, ostensibly to get bicyclists to a left turn lane, you must have countdown pedestrian signals. And I don't think a lot of people, that has stuck out to a lot of people for that interim approval. But I will say, I also think in that scenario, practitioners are installing two-stage turn boxes instead of extending the bike box all the way to the left turn lane. But that's something important to remember when you're using that treatment type. Some things that are new from that weren't in the interim approval is that since you're moving the vehicle stop bar, the general travel lane stop bar away from the intersection, you must recalculate your yellow change and red clearance intervals, which makes sense, but it wasn't included in the interim approval. So make sure that you're looking at that when you are installing bike boxes at a signalized intersection. And then another thing that's new too, I had never really thought of this. I didn't really think of it as being an issue before, but if you have that vehicles stop here for the stop bar, you can now put an accept bike plaque underneath it for that stop here on red sign. It's interesting to me because without the advanced stop bar going across the bike lane, I don't think that there would be a confusion about where bikes stop, but you have that option if you like. And then also two-stage turn boxes have made the jump from interim approval 20. And for interim approval 20, it explicitly said you could only use them at signalized intersections. The 11th edition is silent on traffic control. And I think that's intentional. I think that we're seeing these two-stage turn boxes used in a lot more scenarios than just signalized intersections. As we start to incorporate more two-way bike facilities, we can use these to get more creative on how to get bikes into and out of those facilities. This is a section that took me a little while to digest and really understand, but two-stage turn boxes live in both the marking section and the sign section in Part 9 because they do have both of those pavement markings and signage. The signage section to me is a little confusing, but ultimately what it comes down to is that if your bike facility is approaching an intersection where the general travel lanes can't turn, you need to let bicyclists know that they need to stay in the bike lane. So in those scenarios, you are required to use the R923 series signs, and they are very specific. There's a specific advanced sign that you need to use, and then you need to use two different signs at the near side of the intersection and the far side of the intersection. If bikes are, if turns are allowed for everyone at the intersection, bikes are obviously permitted to leave the bike lane and take a left turn lane, for example. So these signs become optional. This figure kind of helps with the text. It's an interesting case because I think if you have a 6-lane arterial street, it's questionable that you would have a conventional bike lane. So sometimes that can be a little overwhelming. But I do think the figure helps when you're reading the text to really understand exactly what the requirements are here. And then interestingly, right after that section, there is a new bicycle jug handle section. Again, I wasn't really aware of this being an issue in the past, and it's a very large, kind of confusing graphic with a lot going on. Ultimately, they're talking about, like this example here in Pittsburgh again, a bike bay. You have a T intersection and you need to have some space outside of the roadway where bikes can turn to be able to use a signalized intersection. In this case, the section actually says that if bikes are required to use this turn box, this two-stage movement, the signs are optional. So even though it's kind of the same scenario as a two-stage turn box, it's a different requirement. Also, interestingly enough, they have, I actually need to count them, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 regulatory signs to control this very specific situation. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then finally, counterflow bike lanes have been incorporated, which is a huge win. But there are some issues, I think, or maybe some missed opportunities here. The first one is that I know a lot of agencies, when they install a counterflow bike lane, they like to take those existing one-way signs and put an accept bike sign underneath, especially in an urban environment where you have a lot of sign clutter and utility conflicts and you're not sure where to put new signs. That is really the easiest way to accomplish alerting motorists and bikes of sort of how the traffic operations work. Part 9 requires you to use movement prohibition signs. So you have to put that no left or no right except bikes. And then Part 2 has the one-way signs. And when you think about it, these have to overlap essentially when you install a counterflow bike lane. So it's really going to contribute a lot to that sign clutter. Interestingly enough, again, Part 9 allows for the use of an accept bikes plaque under the one-way signs, but Part 9 specifically prohibits that. So there's a little bit of conflict there. I think maybe FHWA's philosophy might have changed at some point, but Part 9 does prohibit the use of that accept bikes plaque under the one-way sign. And then finally, for counterflow bike lanes, this one was really disappointing to me, but FHWA is advising against putting a counterflow bike lane between a parking lane and a general travel lane. Does not explicitly prohibit it, but it really advises against it. And I think that's a missed opportunity because these facilities, especially in a bike boulevard scenario on neighborhood streets, are a great way to get these facilities in to allow bikes to travel through a neighborhood. There, as far as I know, these have been installed. There's hundreds of these installations at this point, and I'm not aware of any like safety concerns with them. And I also know agencies are looking for standardization of these pavement markings. You often see the double yellow dashed lines to allow motorists to access parking. And obviously, since bikes are traveling in the door zone, but they're in full view of the counterflow parked vehicles, you can really understand why safety concerns with dooring and things like that maybe aren't founded. So it doesn't prohibit you using this, but it does certainly advise against it. And that's it for updates. There's certainly more to cover, but that's my time for today. So with that, I'm going to pass it over. Let's let Jerry share his screen here.
There we go. I had to unmute myself. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jerry Shippa, City Madison Traffic Engineering Department. As the introduction said, I work in traffic signals and lighting, and I wanted to present on some opportunities in the new edition on the traffic signal warrant front and some on bicycle signals. And I know Matt's going to cover that more, so it'll be a good transition into his presentation. So there's a few changes regarding crash warrants and some of the charts, but I think the biggest change to the manual is changing the standard language that references, in this case, table 4C1 for the 8-hour vehicle warrant, changing that from standard to guidance. And what we heard from the FHWA is that they want to reinforce the idea that we are to use our engineering judgment. Like, this is a good tool to kind of get an idea for when a signal is warranted or not, but there's going to be local considerations, and you're going to have your experience and lived experiences nearby that I think there's a real push to bring it more into the guidance rather than a standard. So what does this mean, and how do we kind of evaluate intersections? So just to kind of get our brains going on this, it's probably not going to be too hard to imagine this, but imagine we have a main arterial street in our city that's 2 or more lanes per direction. So it could be a 4-lane divided highway or a 6-lane divided highway. You might have high traffic volumes to where you've got several thousand vehicles per hour for the most part of the day. And maybe you have high speeds on that. It's posted 35, but the 85th percentile speed is over 40 miles an hour. And the side street is a local or a small collector street, maybe single lane. Maybe you got some land use that there's some desire to cross, but there's not, enough vehicle or pedestrian volume to meet a warrant, but, it's not nothing. It's probably not that hard to imagine this scenario. We've probably got a bunch of those intersections. And as a matter of fact, tonight, we have our annual traffic signal priority list going to our transportation commission. I looked at that list, and of all the intersections that have been asked, this scenario is on 20%, shows up on that list, makes up 20% of the intersections. And if you're like us, some of these intersections are kind of far away from other signalized intersections. And if we apply the signal warrant, and we say, no, there's not enough pedestrian crossings, no, there's not enough vehicle crossings, we're not going to put a signal there. It's doesn't meet warrant. And if we are, really only saying no because it doesn't meet warrant, what is that? What are we telling people? We're kind of telling people, well, if you want to cross the street safely, maybe you're having a hard time finding gaps, or you just don't feel like that's a risk you want to take. Either get in a car and drive, or walk. It could be 15 minutes out of your way just to cross 80 feet. So operationally, what does that say? That's kind of saying one person's 15-minute delay is kind of more important than other people's potentially 31-second delay. So are we going to stop, 15 divided by 31? Are we going to stop 28 drivers for the full duration of that crossing? And maybe is there other users that might benefit, like side street drivers that have just kind of given up on using that intersection? And some other elements kind of about engineering judgment are, what is the geometry of the intersection? What if we reimagine that geometry different? What does the MUTCD signal warrant say about that? And doesn't really give us much guidance there. So we kind of are left to use our own imagination. So in this image, we had a fairly high crash problem. We could have plopped down a traffic signal, but instead we did some geometric changes, got rid of some conflicts. And technically it didn't meet any of the signal warrants, but we installed the signal anyways because we saw an opportunity to add a signalized pedestrian crossing. And it would serve well with the neighborhood bikeway and some higher, there's a target to the south side and neighborhood to the north side with a bike path. So, like there's some just kind of different things to consider because not all signals are the same. Not every intersection is the same. And then on top of this, how would you time this signal? What are your priorities? In the lower corner is not this signal, but another similar signal. When we first started these, we timed them to be perfectly coordinated for drivers and found out nobody liked them. They ended up waiting in the median for half the cycle. So you ended up with like a 1.5 cycle delay. Well, we can time these differently. So timing of signals and geometry of the intersection, it all kind of comes together, but it's kind of outside the MUTCD warrant analysis. And then other devices. So in this case, we have an intersection that we were told no by the state that we could not install a signal. The yellow circle is a signalized intersection on East Washington Avenue, which serves as US 151. And then just to the south, one block, about 400 feet away, is a parallel route. Now, East Washington Avenue is not that great to bike on, but we have a bike boulevard to the north, one block, and we kind of thought, let's maybe start turning the block south to a bike boulevard. And no, doesn't meet signal warrant, even though we have a fair amount of pedestrian crossings here. We had a fair amount of crashes that could have been corrected by a signal. And we had that signal cue backing through the intersection, which causes people to start crossing in between stopped vehicles, which is a dangerous scenario. But no signal because it doesn't meet warrant. So instead we install an RFE because there's also concern about operations, but a signal can be coordinated. A PED hybrid beacon can be coordinated, though there's some evidence that shows maybe you want to pay attention to PED delay on that. But an RFB has to be on a hot button. So it was kind of weird to get feedback that no, we're concerned about operations. So put in a device that can at any moment, in theory, stop traffic. So here comes that dual left off a green, and we stop traffic with an actuation, or drivers are seeing a green up ahead, and now we have an RFB showing them maybe they should stop for the pedestrian in the crosswalk. So again, another engineering judgment is, does this meet warrant? And if no, but maybe there's some other considerations, some other context that you might want to consider. And what really started kind of getting my mind kind of looking at some of these warrants and thinking maybe there's a little bit more, more questions we have to ask is, years ago, remember looking at the pedestrian warrant versus vehicle warrant, and what I've got shown here is kind of comparing the two for the peak hour volumes. If we have an arterial with that we have so much traffic that we're far up to the right-hand side on that chart. We actually need more pedestrians crossing than we do drivers for a single lane approach. And then at 35 miles an hour, we lower that pedestrian threshold by down to 70% because rightfully so, there's some concern about safety. And then again, at 40 miles an hour, we lower the vehicle threshold again by the same percentage because again, concerns about safety. And those are good, but it creates a situation where again, a 40-mile-an-hour arterial, we need 93 people crossing on foot and we need 75 in a car. And there's no consideration for what if I have 92 on foot? And what if I have 74 in the car? Well, no, both of them don't meet, no signal. This is where engineering judgment comes in. And we have to start thinking, you know, there's some more considerations to take into account. And I want to highlight this too. This kind of bothers me as an engineer that has to go in front of the public and in front of commissions when it comes to the traffic signal warrants, is that there's no citation in this manual as far as where do these numbers come from. So when we say, no, it doesn't meet traffic signal warrant, and someone says, well, where does that number come from? I'm sure someone did a study at some point, but I don't know where to point them to. I don't know where some of these numbers come from. Some maybe have just kind of always been there and have been iterated on edition over edition, but you'd have to dive through probably decades of paperwork just to try and track the changes and see where and why that might have happened. But there's no easy reference, like go look at this study and this is where that number comes from. So leaving the signal warrants aside, and again, kind of to wrap that idea up, is just really taking into account context. And I think as we analyze intersections and we rely more on engineering judgment and less on a flow chart, you're going to really have to make the case for a signal. You're going to have to evaluate it, you know, show operationally, shows all the possible geometric changes. But I think by doing so, we're going to have a much better idea of what the final operation is going to look like and what, you know, potential is really there. So bicycle signals, like I said, I'm not going to go into too much depth because Matt's going to take this and go deeper with it, but it is now in the MUTCD. Something I've heard in the past is why include bike signals? Is it just kind of bells and whistles for bikes? But my opinion, the answer is no. This is actually a huge operational benefit. In this picture, we've got a 125-foot crossing. We are required to have a near side bike signal for the MUTCD. But just crossing the street, you know, who takes longer to cross? Someone walking or someone biking? You know, oh, just have the bikes push the ped button. Well, now that's going to stop traffic for 42 seconds versus a bike signal, which could be timed more appropriately for bikes. And we only have to, you know, give them maybe an 18-second phase. So it can really actually matter quite a bit when it comes to operations, as well as added safety. And the final thing I want to say on this is just a little bit of a plug here. That is our first 4-inch near side bike signal. I believe it's the first in the state of Wisconsin. It's always been in the interim approval, but it's kind of hard to come by. And if you are familiar with the MUTCD, you are to mount near side signals 7 feet above the pavement. Well, if you're mounting a near side signal, the whole point of a near side signal is to be more visible from the near side. If it's 7 feet up on the pole, it's not very visible if you're waiting right under the pole. So I'm hoping to see more of this in Madison and hopefully see more of it elsewhere. But this can be mounted as low as, I think, 3 or 4 feet. This one's at 4 feet. Or 5 feet. We're gonna go lower to 4 feet next time. But just a bit of a plug for this because I think they're really cool and we've gotten some positive feedback on that. So that is it for my presentation, and we're gonna pass it on to Matt to talk more about bike signals.
Thank you, Jerry. Let me just share my screen here and then we will get started. All right, so my name is Matt Johnson. I'm a capital project manager and the bikeways coordinator at the Montgomery County, Maryland Department of Transportation. I do want to note that any opinions expressed in this presentation represent my personal views and do not represent the Montgomery County Department of Transportation or the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. So at long last, a new manual. This has been long overdue. We've been waiting for this for a very long time. The 2009 manual was in effect for 14 years. And so we finally got the new manual, and I was like a kid on Christmas when this was released. I opened it and I went straight to the bike signals chapter. There were some big wins in this, and I'll talk about some of those. And there's also some disappointments and things where we didn't get what we wanted, like the bike signals chapter, which was really kind of a gut punch for me. We have challenges, but we also have opportunities, and so we'll go through that. I think, one of the first wins we have here is the new principles statement. So I'm not going to read all this text, but you can feel free to go to the manual and look at this. But basically, in the 10th edition or the 2009 edition, there's no mention of vulnerable road users. But if you go to the 11th edition, right here on this is the very first section, 1A01, the purpose here is achieved through the following digits, one of which is to promote safety, inclusion, and mobility for all users. So no longer can you pretend that the manual does not intend for this, for our road network to be safe for everybody. Target road users is also a new section. You can see in the 10th edition, there's nothing here. In the 11th edition, we have, again, another note that that we need to control, that we need to be focused on vulnerable road users, and that vulnerable road users have very little to no protection from crash forces. And these users also include bicyclists, pedestrians, and persons with disabilities. And the protection of these vulnerable road users is a priority in this manual. So again, we can't pretend that the manual is not supposed to be protecting people who aren't in vehicles. Peter already touched on this, so I'll kind of breeze through it. But in the 10th edition, the manual said that the posted speed limit should be within 5 miles per hour of the 85th percentile speed. And I know that in your states, like in my state, people treat the speed limit more as a guide than a rule. And they say, oh, I'm only going 5 over, I'm only going 7 or 8 over, I'm probably not going to get a ticket. In the state where I practice, you have to be going 12 miles an hour above the speed limit before you get a ticket from an automated camera. So that's what people basically have treated the new limit as. And so what happens is over time, speed limits would creep up because the 85% of traffic is going faster than the speed limit. We got to move the speed limit up. But in the 11th edition, and again, I'm not going to read all this, it talks about how we have to look at a broader context, including the roadway environment, roadway characteristics, the geographic context, a lot of things. And this is a huge win. And I'll also note that it specifically notes that on urban and suburban arterials and on rural arterials that serve as main streets through developed areas of communities, the 85th percentile speed should not be used. And that's huge. This is a huge win. And Katie talked about the interim approvals, so I'm not going to belabor those points. The main win here is that when they were interim approvals, it was more challenging for local jurisdictions to use them. In the state where I practice, Maryland, we had blanket approvals from the state for all of these, so we didn't, as a local jurisdiction, have to apply every single time we wanted to use one, but we did have to keep a record of them, and we had to be prepared to remove them, because all interim approvals, you have to be willing to remove them within a certain number of months after interim approval is rescinded. If that ever happens, it's rare, but it can happen. And so some jurisdictions just might not have been comfortable spending a bunch of money to install things like this, and then with the risk of having to spend more money to remove them if the interim approval was rescinded. So it's good that these are in the manual. As Katie noted, there are some caveats to that, but I think generally a win. Another, I think, potential win, although this depends a little bit on how you read this, is in section 4D03, which, quote, requires jurisdictions to consider the needs of bicyclists along bikeways. And I'll note that bikeway here is a defined term, which is a generic term for any road, street, path, or way that in some manner specifically designated for bicycle travel, regardless of whether such facilities are designated for the exclusive use of bicycles or are to be shared with other transportation modes. So that means you got sharrows on the road, you've got a bike route sign, you've got a bikes allowed to use full lane. Those are all roads that have been designated for bicycle travel, and therefore they become bikeways. And that means that when signal timing and actuation is being evaluated, that the needs of bicyclists must be considered. Now, what does that mean? I think a conservative reading of this would suggest that when you're designing your clearance interval, you have to build in enough clearance time for a cyclist to cross. And if you're in center city Philadelphia, where the streets are like 2 lanes wide, you probably don't need much consideration, because the bicyclist is going to clear that intersection just about as fast as the car is going to clear. But if you're out on Las Vegas Boulevard where you might have 8 or 10 lanes of traffic, a bicyclist who's entering just as the light turns yellow is going to take longer to clear, and you don't want to be giving green signals to the side, to the cross traffic, if you have cyclists still in the intersection. So a conservative reading would say, well, we've at least got to make sure that the clearance intervals are sufficient for bicycles. But I think a more liberal reading of this would suggest that if you have a corridor, I practice in Maryland, but I live in Washington, D.C., and I frequently bike on the M Street Northwest separated bike lane. And I can tell you that the signals are set for about 20, 25 miles an hour. So in the evenings, not during rush hour, but in the evenings, if you're in a car, you can make it pretty much all the way across downtown without hitting a red light. If I'm on an e-bike, I can make it maybe 6 or 7 blocks before I fall out of the green wave. But if I'm on a conventional bike, I go 2 blocks and I just miss the green. And I have to wait through a whole light cycle. Then I go 2 more blocks, and then I have to wait a whole light cycle. Then I go 2 more blocks, and I have to wait a whole light cycle. So I think a more liberal reading would say you've got to consider the needs of cyclists in these corridors and maybe set your timing so that you're not inconveniencing cyclists. Now, it doesn't mandate this. It is a standard, but it says that you must consider it. It doesn't say you have to do it. So your engineer in your local jurisdiction might say, well, we considered it and we didn't do it. And that's okay. But I think this gives us some room to push for things like this in the manual in your local jurisdictions. As Jerry mentioned, I'm going to talk a bit about bike signals. These were an interim approval. They're now in the manual. The NPA that was proposed back in 2020, the Notice of Proposed Amendment, had a pretty significant liberalization around bike signals in it, but none of that was incorporated in the final rule in the 11th edition. And so this makes it really difficult to use bike signals. You can basically only use bike signals when you have an exclusive turning movement that's phase protected from the bikes, or you have an exclusive bike phase, like maybe a diagonal crossing, or you temporarily separated the bikes where nobody goes except for the bikes. But other than that, it's really difficult to use a bike signal because you can't have any conflicting movements. So one of the things that we know is a great treatment for pedestrians is the leading pedestrian interval. It's been proven safety strategy that if you let pedestrians get established in the intersection before turning traffic is released, it improves yielding behavior and it reduces the risk of crashes. However, we can't do the same treatment with bicycles, even though we know that it's also a treatment that will work for bicycles, because some jurisdictions have actually implemented this. In New York City and Washington, D.C., it is legal for bicyclists to start crossing when the walk sign comes on, when there's a leading pedestrian interval. But if we wanted to use bike signals here, we can't do that because a leading interval indicates that there's a non-part of the interval that's leading. So this example here is a picture that I took in St. Paul, Minnesota. You can see here that the signals are red for traffic, and there's a no turn on red restriction here. The bike signal is green. And so bikes get a 7 or 8 second head start here. They get to cross over, and then the traffic is released. There's actually a flashing yellow arrow that is accompanied with this. So that turning traffic is sort of indicated that they have to yield. But bikes can continue to go even though traffic has been released. That's not possible under the 11th edition. This was a request to experiment, which is why it's possible in St. Paul, but it makes it very difficult to use these. And it's kind of nonsensical because if we use this sign right here that says bikes use ped signal, you can have a conflicting movement with a bike lane and crossing a right turning movement. And so that's one way you can do a leading bike interval, but you can't use bike signals. And part of the problem that Jerry kind of alluded to, not just is that if we care about the timing for vehicles, but in Maryland, under Maryland law, and I'm sure under the laws of if not all the states, most of the states, once that hand starts flashing, legally you can't enter the intersection. So if I say bikes use ped signal, it allows me to let bikes use the leading pedestrian interval, but it also means that they have to stop crossing maybe 20 or 30 seconds before the light changes, even though they might only take 5 or 8 seconds to cross the intersection. Now, that's not a rule that's enforced a whole lot, but technically, we shouldn't be giving people traffic control devices that we know that they're not going to follow, because it degrades the respect for the traffic control device. So this is a factor that I hope is considered when there's revisions. I know that Federal Highway is interested in some more experimentation, and we actually have an experiment that we've applied for. It has not yet been granted by Federal Highway for a project to have that conflicting movement for right turns. Another thing that's new in the manual is the R10-40 series signs. And these are completely new. They have never been used in the United States. They have not been experimented on. This is something that Federal Highway cooked up and added in the 11th edition. Usually stuff doesn't get into the manual until it's been experimented on quite a bit and there's results, but this is a new thing. And we have some questions about it. One, what's the sign supposed to mean? How are we supposed to use it as practitioners? And how does the general public understand it? And these signs are now required to be posted next to every single bike signal, not every single intersection with a bike signal, but every single bike signal itself. So this could contribute a lot to signal clutter. I'll also note that there is a missing variant. No, not Loki, but the right turn only version of this sign, because there may be some situations where you have a right turn signal for bikes. For example, maybe you have a cycle track on the left side of a roadway, and you govern that right turn. That sign was not created, so there's a missing variant there. So I actually have a poll question. We'll do a little audience interactivity here. Let me see if I can launch the poll here. I might need some help from Madison here. The view looks different now. Okay, here we go. So the poll's up. So the question here, we have a green bike signal and the bike signal through only. Does this mean that bikes can only go straight and that they can't turn at all? Or does it mean that this signal only governs bikes making the through movement, that you can still make the other movements, but this signal doesn't govern you? And I just want to point out that this is a uniform manual, so if anybody gets the wrong answer, you won't be able to get your AICP CMs at the end of the presentation. Just so you know, if you get the wrong answer. So keep that in mind. All right, so I'm kidding. Of course, you can get your CMs whether you get the right answer or not, because you know what? There isn't a right answer, or we don't know what it is. And the fact that, you know, the numbers are still coming in, but the fact is that you get 41%, 42% voting for one, 57 voting for the other. That doesn't bode well for user understanding, right? I'm going to end this poll and go to the next slide. So let's do a bonus question here. When we have the red bike signal, and Madison, if you don't mind launching the second poll question, if we have a red bike signal in conjunction with the through and right signal, right sign here, does this mean that if a bicyclist arrives on the red signal, can they turn right while the signal's red, or do they have to wait? We need the other question launched. So let's see here. Can I do that here? Okay, here we go. All right, so that poll should be up. So, because the sign here says through and right and it's red, does that mean I can or can't turn right on red? So again, we're seeing about 50% on each side of this equation. We don't know what the right answer is. So it's exactly 50 right now. So I'm going to go ahead and move on with the presentation, but thank you for voting on that. This is a problem. So I'm not going to, this is not a question I'm going to ask, at least not with a poll, but when we have the through and the right sign and we have a green bike signal, does this mean that bikes can go straight or right, but they can't turn left? Or does it mean that when it's green, bikes can turn left, but they have to use a different signal than this one? Does it mean that when bikes are turning right, do they have to yield to pedestrians who are in the crosswalk or not, right? Because if this was an arrow signal for the right movement, the walk sign would have to be in don't walk. But with this, it doesn't make sense for that. So this is an example. This is a two-way cycle track here. This is actually in Silver Spring. This is a project that I built. Please ignore the dislodged concrete barrier there that has been resolved. But you know, if you were making this right turn, the walk sign, and there's not a bike signal here now, but if there were, you're making this right turn at the same time the bike signal is green. Well, the bike signal is not really intended to govern this right turn movement. It's intended to govern the through movement. And we would expect you to be able to turn right here, but we would expect you to yield to pedestrians. But how is the user going to understand this? We as practitioners, as planners, couldn't come to the same consensus on an answer in this presentation. So how is someone who's biking down the street at 12.5 miles an hour going to have time to interpret that as they're approaching the signal? So I think that this was that these signs are not ready for prime time, but we're required to use them. And it's important that we know, because here's an example of a project that I have in development right now. We're very close to going to construction. Two-way cycle track, two-way street. We have right turns. For cyclists who are going southbound, which is sort of going from right to left in this image, bikes are allowed to turn right at this intersection, and they're allowed to turn right on red at this intersection. But which sign do I use? The through and the right to indicate that they can turn right? Or do I use through signal, which might make them think that they can't turn right? I don't know. And the same is the situation for the left movement here. The movement that's going from the left to the right, which is northbound. Do I use the through only? Keep in mind, there is a two-stage cue box here, so bikes can turn right. They use a different signal. Or can they turn left? They are supposed to be able to turn left after yielding to oncoming cyclists. We don't know what sign to use. And I actually asked some people from Federal Highway at the National Committee meeting, and they weren't sure which was the correct answer. So it seems to me that they had not really fully thought through this sign, but now we're required to use it. And that's a problem because we don't know how to use it and the public doesn't know what it means. So with that, the last opportunity we have here that I wanted to talk about is the fact, and Peter mentioned this, 32 states currently have either state supplements or state manuals. And those all have to be updated by January of 2026. And this could be an opportunity. Maryland's manual, Maryland has its own state manual, is a fairly conservative manual. It takes stuff that's in the federal manual and deletes it. Can't use it in Maryland. So this is an opportunity for us to make some positive changes in state manuals. If you have a state like Maryland's that maybe takes stuff out, a chance to get this stuff in the state manuals. And I'm actually on the task force that's working on the Maryland manual, so we'll see what we're able to accomplish. But this is an opportunity. So if you're in a state, if you're in one of these states that's blue or green on the map, you may have an opportunity to work with your state to adopt changes in your state manual that make the federal manual work a little better for them. And that's my presentation. I think it's time to go to questions. I think, Peter, are you going to field the questions?
That's the plan. Thanks, Matt. That was an awesome presentation. Really hit on a lot of different topics. Love the polls. A little bit confused about the confusion there. I wanted to vote on the poll. I don't know which way I would have voted, actually. So that was fantastic. Want to just encourage everybody to jump in, ask for Q&A, and just type into the chat box. Before we do that, I want to just thank Katie, Jerry, and Matt for sharing these wonderful insights. We have a quick attendance poll, and then we'll begin the Q&A. So just want to get a sense for how many are you sitting with? And I know a few people had to jump off because it's 1 o'clock and then West Coast and lunch is over, but just jump on that poll real quick and then we'll get to the Q&A. Looks like we're pretty close to the folks that are still with us. Give you another 10 seconds. All right, we have a nice big group. Okay, we'll end the poll now. 3, 2, 1. Great. And so we'll just let's see. So let's see if we get in the Q&A. I had several questions that I have been sending out. Starting with Steve Arnold, he said, so can the state manual update process be used to remove these problematic new signs? Matt, that's probably a good one for you.
I think that one's a tough one. My understanding of the process is that states cannot they can't modify a standard that would make it less restrictive than the federal standard is the way I understand the process. Now, fundamentally, I think it comes down to your FHWA region office to approve it. So it may vary a little bit throughout the country. But essentially, because those are required in the federal manual, I don't think that your state could say, well, they're not required in our state. Your state could say bike signals are prohibited in our state, and then it's not an issue. But I don't think that they could say they can remove a standard. And if the other panelists have a different opinion, feel free to share it. But that's my understanding of the process.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were presenting that, you can't also have a right turn conflict with the bikeway. You can't have the green for the vehicle movement go at the same time as the bike signal. So I think you have to make that exclusive. So actually you should add the left turn and let it be a total bike scramble and just say no cars can move it ever. Just kidding. Katie, any other thoughts on that?
No.
Yeah, the takeaway for me was that every bike signal that I've designed in Portland, and I think we're up to 50 or so, they're all non-compliant. They all need a new sign. And, that seems a bit problematic if you think about, gosh, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Do we really have a problem? I don't think that we have a epidemic of bike crashes at intersections because of a bike signal. We're separating them in time, and that's just an issue that it's a little bit of a made up thing.
Yeah, I think Federal Highway was concerned that cyclists see that green bike signal and think, hey, I can do anything I want. And really, especially if you've got the green markings and the bike lane extension lines, I think it's pretty clear that the bike signal means you follow the green brick road across the intersection. But maybe there's some non-clarity. And I know of at least one intersection, either in Cambridge or Boston, where there's two bike signals that govern two different movements. They have a left turn movement and a right, kind of a through right movement, and they're governed by different bike signals. And maybe this is helpful in that particular context, but to require it everywhere, even when there's no ambiguity, I think is a problem.
All right. We have a question from Michael King. He said, I would use the bike signal sign that indicates all potential movements. So this would be consistent with other signals. You can turn right on red, then turn right on red. The green signal does not affect you. And I think that's certainly a liberal approach to it.
Well, in our case, the example that I gave at the end of the project that we're in design for, this is where we requested a request to experiment from Federal Highway. In this case, left turns are protected. You'll only be able to turn left on the green arrow across the bikeway, but southbound right turns, which cross the bikeway, they're all very low volume right turns. They're all like less than 2 right turns per cycle. They're all very low volume, even at peak hours. So in that case, like bikes really can't go across the main line. They're not, I mean, I guess there's a 2-stage queue box, but you're not supposed to just go across the main line. There's a lot of parallel traffic. So that the all-way movement's not the case, but that's on my project, right? But we have this standard sign for a non-standard kind of thing. And the question is not how would we professionals figure out how to use it? It has to be also, how does the general public understand it? Because if we think it's one thing and the general public thinks it's something different, then the sign is meaningless, right? So we have to understand, or if they can't agree on what it means, right? Which you all couldn't agree on what these signs meant. So that's a problem.
Yeah, Samuel jumped in and said, in Utah, as a police officer or judge has indicated the word only indicates the only allowable movement. So that's an important distinction there as well. Okay, I'm looking at, I think the question I had was for Katie related to the clearance intervals and, this notion of, gosh, what should we be doing with yellow and red? Is there something specific? The way we've approached it in Portland is to say, gosh, you know what? I think that the calculation, it's not a physics problem explicitly. Like you can't assume that bike riders are going to enter the intersection the same way as vehicle drivers. And the law says that you can enter the intersection on the last 10th of a second of yellow in a lot of cases in a permissive yellow state. So then you would have to have the red clearance be calculated out to be that long distance with a low speed. And I think that's to me, that's very problematic. You think about, should we allow my 12-year-old to enter the intersection on the last 10th of a second of yellow? I don't think they're going to do that on their bike. But maybe I'm wrong. Katie, got any thoughts on how you've seen different folks approach this from a calculation of yellow and red?
To be honest, it's the first time that I've seen that consideration with a bike box. In my experience, it hasn't been evaluated at all. You just plop in your turn box and you go. Kind of similar with the pedestrian countdown as well. So there are kind of two things that I think, according to the MUTCD, practitioners need to be aware of and implementing.
Yeah, Jerry, you're a signal engineer. Were you surprised by that language? Any thoughts on how you're going to approach that?
I would say, there are other ways to kind of handle that clearance interval. If you have it, and this is not going to be the case for every intersection, but if you have video detection, there are ways to add mid-intersection detection zones to extend the red. That way, if you want to kind of, like you're kind of saying, like, we don't really want to give you that full crossing distance, but if there is that zone in the middle of the intersection, we know that someone's there, we can. Other ways to handle it is you maybe calculate that crossing distance to some more visible location, and then a leading ped interval is the same thing as stopping traffic. You kind of, the way we handle it in Madison is we'll kind of use some tricks with leading ped intervals and video detection, things like that, to kind of eke out those edge cases, make it a little bit safer in that regard, but not, every cycle, or, calculate it. And then we have a leading ped interval. So I think there are some ways around that, but yeah, you really got to dig into each specific conflict in each location. It's not going to be a kind of off the shelf timing option.
Yeah, that inclusion of tech is really kind of an interesting one. I think using video detection for that purpose, there is some interesting work happening on smart grants to look at video analytics and identifying hotspots and intersections where conflicts occur. I think this is an area where, turn on red restrictions can help us a little bit, because if you have a turn on red happening and somebody's coming through the intersection, that can be where the risk is highest. I think that's one where I'd say the jury's still out, and I've been talking a little bit with some colleagues at FHW about some need for more training there. So maybe a little bit of a teaser that, they're keenly aware that some of these opportunities exist to improve safety using technology and updating our engineering standards to address, this notion of how we go about, designing our intersections. I think the key is, I think this isn't a surprise to any APBP member, but more compact intersections, less lanes, creates a lot better environment than, these wider, bigger intersections that the disparity between a low-speed cyclist and a high-speed car is it can be really challenging from addressing the math differential between those two speeds.
Yeah, Peter, one thing I will point out that I think is interesting, and this was in the interim approval as well, but that the countdown pedestrian signal heads. So if you want to install a marked crossing at a signalized intersection per the MUTCD, you can do that without needing to install those signal heads. But as soon as you want to add that bike box, that triggers the need for that countdown signal head, which is a little interesting, I think, that for pedestrians, you don't need it, but if you add bikes, you do.
Yeah, the reality is in the market, most of them are going to be countdowns today. So,
Yeah.
I think we at Portland, we were pretty early adopters of countdowns. We have had a lot of countdown failures because there's a capacitor that's in there that it failed before the countdown, before the actual signal has failed. So we haven't replaced those countdowns, but it's on the list. We'll get to it. I guess if the countdown's not working, but the rest of the signal is, do we still have a countdown? It's in there, it's just not illuminated. So.
And you also have you may have a situation where you don't have a crosswalk on that leg. You want to put a bike box, there's not a crosswalk at all, let alone a crosswalk signal. And now you can't do that because you have to put in a CPS, but there's no crosswalk. There's a catch-22.
Well, that's just bad design, Matt. You should have a crosswalk in every leg of the intersection.
Sometimes we have to fight with our traffic engineers for crosswalks.
Yeah, I will say too, Peter, the city of Pittsburgh does not have the city budget that Portland does. We still have traffic signals that are on 90-year-old trolley poles. So we're a little behind as far as updating for those signals, although trying to.
I think we have our fair share that are in that range. Maybe not 90, maybe not Pittsburgh old, but we do try our best to get the extended life out of the poles. Okay, we've got about a minute left, so maybe I'll just leave room for one more question. But maybe I'll just say that want to just thank everybody for attending. Looks like we have a few more questions. Maybe we could answer those offline. So maybe I'll turn it back over to Madison and just say thanks everybody for attending, and Madison, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Peter, Katie, Jerry, Matt, wonderful presentation, and thank you for sharing your expertise. And thank you to everyone that's joining us today. We would love to hear from you about your experience today and gather your feedback. When the meeting concludes, you'll see a brief survey. That link will also be emailed to you following this webinar. But thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you again next month. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.